To viewers all, I say hello and bid you welcome to the show. You're watching One Take Shakespeare. I'm your host, Penny, and I'm going to break it down for you in one continuous take. Well, viewers, you may have thought we were done with scansion, but watch out, because it only gets verse. Okay, that was terrible. I apologize. Seriously, though, there are a couple things that I didn't get to go over in my last episode about scansion, so I'm going to talk about them today. Sit back and let's get into verse and prose. Okay, now when we say verse, we mean lines that follow a specific rhythm and are made up of poetic feet. Iambic pentameter is one specific kind of verse. Shakespeare and his contemporaries wrote in iambic pentameter, the most often. But there's one other verse form that shows up fairly frequently-ish in Shakespeare's plays, and it is called trochaic tetrameter. Now, just to recap, a trochee is sort of the inverse of an iamb. It's two syllables, the first one stressed, the second one unstressed. Actually, the word trochee is a trochee. That's useful. Okay, now there are a couple specific situations in which Shakespeare uses trochaic tetrameter. One is when something is supposed to be a poem, sort of in universe, as it were. See, while iambic pentameter is technically verse and technically poetry, Elizabethan audiences were used to hearing it as normal speech. So when a character is supposed to be reading or reciting a poem, a lot of the time it's gonna be in a different meter. Now, trochaic tetrameter is a particularly good meter to use for this because while the 5-beat line of iambic pentameter has a pause at the end, so you can breathe, it sounds a little more natural, but a 4-beat line doesn't. So it sounds more even, more rhythmic and regular, and sometimes even a little sing-song. So it stands out. It's obviously verse. So when Rosalind comes in reading, "From the east to western Ind, no jewel is like Rosalind," you know it's a poem. Or the other situation in which you frequently see tetrameter is when there's magic going on. It's the magical meter. Characters like Puck in A Midsummer Night's Dream or the witches in Macbeth speak in it so you know they're otherworldly. Now, the cool thing about tetrameter here is that it can sound whimsical and lighthearted and fun, like in a lot of Midsummer Night's Dream, or it can be kind of spooky. Let's look at the witch's line in Macbeth, for example. "Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble." It's kind of freaky, right? See, the 4-beat line, since it doesn't have that pause at the end, can let you build up some pretty good momentum, and you can make it sound like things are really building up to a climax. It's pretty cool. Okay, now you may have noticed something about these lines that I've been quoting, and that is, they rhyme. Now, rhyme is another thing that Shakespeare uses to point out certain lines and tell you that something different is going on. Poems will frequently rhyme, and magic will rhyme even if they're not in tetrameter or a different form of verse. And people in love rhyme. Watch out for this, because lovers in Shakespeare rhyme all the time. See what I did there? Seriously though, they will not only speak in couplets themselves, but they will make rhymed couplets out of other people's lines. The first thing you see Romeo do in Romeo and Juliet is come out and start rhyming at Benvolio. Why? Because he's in love. That's what he does. Another place you frequently see rhyme is at the ends of scenes and acts. Now, Shakespeare didn't write with written act and scene divisions in mind. Those were added later by publishers and printers. Lines that rhyme at the end of scenes were more like an audio cue to the audience and sometimes to the actors to tell them that this scene is over and the next scene is going to start. It's also a pretty satisfying way to end a scene, really, kind of like ending a song on the major chord. It sounds done. It sounds finished. Now, this is another thing that can sometimes give you clues about the character talking. If somebody gets to the end of the scene and they have like 3 couplets, maybe they're milking their exit a little. Or if someone says something after the final couplet of a scene, maybe that's something that they just had to say before the scene was over and they left. Okay, now the last thing to keep in mind, and don't kill me here, some of Shakespeare isn't in verse at all. It's in prose. But what's the difference? I hear you cry. Well, verse follows a regular rhythm and prose doesn't. If you read a book or I don't know, a blog entry or basically anything today that isn't a poem, it's gonna be in prose. I'm speaking in prose right now. It's everywhere. All right, now verse and prose are pretty easy to tell apart on the page. Verse looks like this, in a column here with capital letters at the beginning of each line, where prose runs all the way over to the end of the page, like so. If you're listening to it, if the actors are doing their jobs, it's a little more difficult to tell, especially if the verse doesn't rhyme. Oh, that's called blank verse, by the way. We are not used to listening for the differences between verse and prose, but Elizabethan audiences were. Why is it important? Again, character clues. Now, these are not hard and fast rules, but in general, whether a character speaks verse and prose will tell you something about their status and the type of situation they're in. If you're high class or you're being serious business, then chances are you're gonna be speaking verse. If you're lower class or being funny, you speak prose. Sometimes it even switches in the middle of a scene, which is really fun. Let's look at Much Ado About Nothing for a second. Beatrice spends the whole first half of the play snarking at Benedick in prose. But when she hears that he's apparently in love with her, she switches to verse, just like that. And not only verse, rhymed verse. If you're listening for it, it's an immediate indication of how suddenly and drastically she's changed her mind about him. Okay, I think that's about it. Well, it's not it. No, not by a long shot. There's always something new to discover about Shakespeare's language. But I think I'm gonna leave it there for now. You've been watching One Take Shakespeare. See you next time.